The story of the Denver-Palmer Lake bicycle path is a very important and very interesting one in terms of the history of bicycling, and it illustrates the social and political power of bicyclists in Denver and in Colorado around the turn of the century. The Denver-Palmer Lake Bicycle Path organization was headed by the sitting governor of the state of Colorado, Alva Adams. And they raised money and secured rights of way in order to build a path that would continue the Broadway bicycle path south out of Denver down towards Palmer Lake and Monument.
The trail had been used. It had been ridden for many years, clear back in the 1800s with high-wheelers. Some of the people chose to ride the whole thing. From Denver, they ride to Palmer Lake and come back, which was about a century. You know, it's 52 miles each way. Thousands of riders rode the path. You gained an altitude of 2,000 feet. So a lot of the people, of course, would take the train to Palmer Lake for that reason, and they would coast back, you might say, although you don't coast the whole way.
Many of the cyclists quickly found out that it was a lot easier to ride north from Palmer Lake to Denver than to ride south from Denver to Palmer Lake. So the railroads began to transport cyclists south to Palmer Lake, where they would then get off with their bikes and take the easier ride back to Denver.
We haven't found an exact map of the bike route, but from the bits and pieces of information from the manuscript collections at Denver Public Library and other sources, we went to the 1937 aerials and then moved back to a 1901 railroad map. Different roads are noted on the map. The old wagon road, the new road, and those alignments are shown. It would have been that wagon road that the bicyclists were using. By pulling together a variety of old maps, we were able to document at least the city ditch portion of the bike path with great certainty. The Denver-Palmer Lake bike path started on Broadway, ran alongside where the cable car or the trolley was running, and it ran to the city ditch. That crosses Broadway in Englewood, picks that up, and then winds through Englewood and down into Littleton.
And it wound south, wound through Petersburg, which doesn't exist anymore. It wound west, wound east, you know, it was very serpentine.
In September of 1898, in a publication of the League of American Wheelmen, Andrew Gillette wrote an article about the Denver-Palmer Lake cycle path.
For the first 5 miles of its course, the path follows the west side of Broadway, due south from the city. Then upon the brow of a hill, at a point where the city ditch crosses Broadway, it leads off to the right, and from this point to Littleton, a distance of some 5 or 6 miles, it follows the bends of this stream. This is perhaps the most picturesque part of the entire route, taking the cyclist, as it does, away from the roadway, away from the necessity of watching for teams and pedestrians, into the very midst of a luxuriant farm life among fields of waving wheat, barley, oats, alfalfa, and timothy, and resting the eyes upon many a peaceful rural scene. The path turns and twists about, following the devious windings of the stream. The path itself is 10 feet in width and as hard and smooth as it can be, and is bordered for nearly the entire length of the cycle path by large cottonwoods. One of the peculiar features of this path are the cattle guards designed by Peter O'Brien, the city engineer. They are 10 feet by 10 feet in size and are built of timbers placed across the course of the track 5 inches apart, sufficient to prevent cattle crossing, but causing no unpleasant jar to wheels.
And then it comes into the area that we know today as Woolhurst. Woolhurst was an estate at that time, beautiful trees, lovely spot to stop, and there's some photographs that show us that they were there, and it shows us what Woolhurst looked like at the turn of the century. Then they're still winding through, part is Chatfield Reservoir today, and then it comes very close to the Highline Canal. They They crossed over and continued on south.
The cycle path ran through the western edge of Highlands Ranch, generally along the same alignment as the Highline Canal Trail does today. This section of the path was also a popular spot for bicycle racing that occurred on the road just adjacent to the path. The National Wheelmen's Association had their annual meet here in Denver. As part of that meet, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad repaired a portion of the course that occurred on the road between Issaquah to the south of us here and Sedalia. These cycle races attracted a lot of fans. In fact, the railroad would transport them to various spots along the course for them to cheer.